All right, one final topic that I want to talk about before we move on, and move on past this choose your own adventure is why. Why? Right? Why do we follow the object-oriented programming model, which says that we should define classes and we should use objects? Right? Why? It seems like it makes life more complicated. It makes things confusing. It seems like it's not straightforward, right? And there's always a why. There's always an answer why, right? In computer science, what we're trying to do is make the job of the programmer as easy as possible, right? Programmers are inherently lazy, all right? We want to be as efficient as possible. And the object-oriented programming model, which says to define classes and use objects instead of sets of variables, makes life easier, right? And why? Well, it's not clear on this program here, right? But what if our choose your own adventure here was like really long, right? Let's say it was not 88 lines of code. Let's say it was 10,000 lines of code, right? That it was an actual choose your own adventure book, right? And in that book, there were not just one character, the hero, but there were, let's say, 5 different characters, right, in your book. They all had a health, a name, money, attack, weapon. Not only were there 5 characters, but there were also 15 enemies. And they all had a name, health, money, attack, and a weapon. Not only that, but there were also 3 bosses, right? And those bosses also had a name, health, money, attack, and a weapon. So that's what, 5 characters, 10 enemies, and 3 bosses, and then let's say 1 final boss, right? Well, if we didn't follow the object-oriented programming model and create a class character, what we would need to do is create this variable, this variable, this variable, this variable, and this variable, 5 variables for each of the 5 characters, right? The hero would have to have those sets of variables. The archer would need to have those 5 sets of variables. The knight would have to have those 5 sets of variables to describe their name and money and health and all that. The enemies, each of the 10 enemies would also need to have a set of 5 variables. That's 10 times 5. That's 50 variables to describe the enemies. We have 3 bosses, so that's 3 times 5. That's 15. We have this last final boss, which is another 5, right? So in total, it would be, 15, 18, 19 times 5, whatever that is, right? So 20 times 5 is 100. 100 variables we would need to have up here, right? And all throughout our program, we would need to use those 100 variables. Okay, so instead of doing that, what we can do in the object-oriented programming model is create a class character. And for each of these different actors in our book, we can create an object, right? And store those 5 variables inside of a single variable and use those single variables in our programs. Now, what is easier to do? Juggle 100 variables for these different characters, or use objects for each of these characters? Well, it's obvious. It's use an object for each of the characters and define a class. Use the class as the blueprint for how to create the object, and your life is much simpler, right? We're going to go ahead and move on from this type of a program where it's like choose your own adventure to building video games, right? And in those video games, each sprite is going to have a set of variables associated with it. And one of the games we're going to build has like 100, 200 sprites on the screen at one time, right? And so it would be impossible. Well, I don't know. I don't want to say impossible, but it would be very difficult to program that game without using the object-oriented programming model, without using a class definition and objects instead of a set of variables for every sprite on the screen. Okay. So if at the end of our work in this lesson series, That's what I want you to understand, is that the object-oriented programming model and using classes and objects is to make your life easier. All right. This is a simple program, so it's not clear that that this is actually making your life easier. But in the more complicated programs, you'll see that it would be near impossible to do without the object-oriented programming model. All right.